Hi, and welcome to another edition of Why Economics Matters. My name is Bob. This episode is going to be called The Millennials Shall Inherit the Earth. It's going to be a very macro edition of my podcast today. And just to go over again, my macro thinking is not what's going to happen next week or even a couple of weeks from now or even a month from now. If you're watching my videos and then coming back a month later and telling me I'm wrong, wait. Then you can come back and tell me I'm wrong. I took no end of shit in the post-February 28th invasion of Iran when I said, this is going to happen. And, after 3 weeks, people are coming back to me and saying, you're full of shit and blah, 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 because they don't understand what macro thinking is. It was a very easy thing to say. We invaded Iran. They're going to close the Straits of Hormuz. If we do X, Iran is going to respond with ballistic missiles. They're going to be hitting UAE. They're going to be taking out port facilities in Israel and UAE and Saudi Arabia. And those were all very easy macro calls. But then I went further to say Iran is winning, which was very, very controversial, I think, for a lot of people. Again, we're not going to be speaking Farsi. A win for Iran isn't they're going to be invading New York City. A win for Iran is basically to survive intact, which they are, and they are winning, which again probably pisses a lot of people off. But the macro thinking behind that is they close the Straits of Hormuz. The knock-on effect of that is going to be high energy costs, shortages. I said shortages in Europe, in Asia. That's happened. In America, not shortages, extremely high oil prices. And I got a whole bunch of crap after 2-3 weeks when the price would go up and then come back down. The idea of the Trump taco, basically he's just saying shit because he understands that he is on a timer. And I said this back then, he's on a timer when we invaded, hit a timer. We can only do this for so long. Iran can do it for as long as they need to because it's their land. They have home field advantage. We don't. Once the straits closed, once they started hitting oil facilities and oil prices started to go up, he kept talking the price down, but here we are. I just passed my favorite barometer for oil prices, the gas station Maverick behind me, about 20 miles, 440 unleaded, 550 diesel. I said at the time, macro thinking, that is untenable, that cannot last. Here we are. Oil prices are now 100% over $100. He cannot talk it down anymore. The latest taco was, I don't want to go back to war because I'm being begged by all these Arab and Middle Eastern countries to not do it. I'm not going to do it. So he's trying to talk the price of oil down. He's being accused of helping his buddies. That's just a happening. His big thing is he needs to get oil prices below $100 or he's going to lose the elections, all the elections. It's too late. It's already baked in. That's what I was trying to get at with macro. So how does this affect, or what does this have to do with the millennials? Maybe just tangentially the fact that Trump is a boomer. All the people around him are a bunch of boomers and late stage Xers. So we're going to define what the generations are first so we can understand where they're coming from, why it's why it's so important, macro speaking. Baby boom generation was born post-World War II. 1946-ish, we'll call it. I don't know what the dictionary is going to say. 46 pretty much runs up to 1963. I'm an Xer, late stage Xer or old Xer, born in 67. Our generation, which is really kind of irrelevant in the conversation, only in that there are older Xers that probably might as well just be lumped in with the baby boom, which is where this whole thought process started. And then you get the millennials born 1981. They run all the way up to 96, 97. I can't remember the exact cutoff date. So those are the, basic yardsticks. This whole idea started probably about a year and a half ago when I was still living in Ohio. And one of my friends, she's definitely a millennial, called me a boomer. She's like, okay, boomer. And that just insulted me to no fucking end. And I really upset about trying to figure out why. And I've been mulling this idea now for, again, almost a year and a half. So let's start with the boomers. What constitutes a boomer? Not just when they're born, but but the circumstances of their birth and the world they were born into versus Xers. Not really going to spend a lot of time on X because we are almost like the silent generation. There truly was a silent generation that existed just before the baby boom, but after the greatest generation, the World War II generation. We're like them. We're the middle child of history. Nobody really gives a crap about us, but everybody gives a crap about the baby boom. And in the very, very near future, that's what this is about, is everybody's going to care about the millennials because they are inheriting the earth. That's what this is going to be about. So the baby boom was born after World War II from parents who lived through World War II. They were not kids they were the ones who fought World War II. They were the ones who went through the absolute misery of the Great Depression. They lived through the massive migration from the farms to the cities. They built the late stage of the Industrial Revolution. They built the infrastructure that we are still, in some cases, using today. Just to give you an idea, because we're going to go into infrastructure and the importance that plays into prosperity for whatever generation. The World War II generation, the Great Depression generation, who built so much of the base infrastructure. For instance, off the coast of Lake Erie, off of where I used to live in Ohio, which was Toledo, out in the lake is an intake where the water for literally all of Northwest Ohio comes from. They built this giant intake way out. Again, they were always thinking ahead. In the enormity of the projects they did, Hoover Dam being another, probably even better one, but this one hit me because of how big they made it. The intake for the water is enormous. They put it way offshore so that you didn't have issues with pollution coming from shore. It took them until literally the year 2000 something to hit the maximum usage of that water intake. That's the way they thought back then. Big infrastructure projects, that's World War II. Of that generation was born the baby boom, which I think, again, it's going to sound like I'm shitting on them, and to a certain degree I am. There's going to be no way for if a boomer's listening to this to not be a little bit insulted, but with that insulting is also an admiration of the fact, they were born with a literal silver spoon in their mouth. Post-World War II was the beginning of the American Renaissance. America took over as the reserve currency of the world, all the things I've talked about, all post-World War II. And it's not to say that generation didn't work hard. They didn't, it isn't like they were literally given things, but they were given a set of circumstances. That's where this friction is coming. This idea of okay boomer is going to be central to everything I'm talking about here. And why that sounds like an insult? Because it is. Millennials are insulting you. When they say, okay, boomer, there's an entire world behind that phrase. And anger, and soon to be probably a hatred. And that's where I'm afraid this is going, this idea of generational warfare and class warfare that I touched in my last one. The idea of the asset class versus the wage class is going to play big into this. So World War II generation gives way to the baby boom. Born 1946, by the 1950s and then going into the 60s, they're coming of actual legal age. When I talk about coming of age, that's not what I'm talking about with the millennials. I'm talking about as they start to take control of things like the economy, political agency, all these things. 1950s, the baby boom is starting to become legally of age, 18, 19. This leads to them becoming very disillusioned with the World War II generation before them, structure, the idea of suburbia and subdivisions and stuff like that. We're going to get into that. Leads to the 1960s and the rebellious nature of early 20s boomers. They're the hippies. They're the ones who are rebelling against everything. And that lasts not very long in the grand scheme of things. I know a lot of these boomers look back on those days fondly, but that lasted in the grand scheme of things for the blink of an eye. The 1960s were pretty much over by Woodstock. then it turns into something else. It's not going to go down too far down that rabbit hole, but it is important to understand where they came from. They came from World War II generation, hardship, Great Depression. Their childhood was formed by all of that. So by the time they're hitting their mid-20s, again, we're talking generally speaking, they start to settle down. They start to have children. They start to have homes. They start to inherit the fact that their parents are starting to die off by the late 1960s. Homes, and this is the most important part to understand, why this isn't insulting a baby boomer. It's just the understanding of how they got the wealth they got and why that's changing and why this is causing so much friction in the world right now. Post-World War II, all those GIs come home. The United States government subsidizes all of these GIs through the GI Bill to help them own homes. Millions upon millions upon millions of men, some women, very few minorities. Again, this is where a lot of that comes from, from a racial point of view, as black soldiers were not given the same treatment as far as the GI Bill was concerned. That's a whole other avenue you could go down with this, where a lot of this animosity is coming from. And again, wealth formation, where did it come from? The GI Bill backed up all of these millions upon millions upon millions of soldiers who came home to go out and buy homes in suburbia. This whole new idea of living, which was get yourself a little tract of land. It appealed to those GIs because they came from farms. If you've ever thought about, why do we have grass? Certain things that we just accept aren't reality. These are illusions that were created by advertisers back in the very early idea of advertising back in the 40s and 50s. You got your little, I can see the sun. Dang it. You got your little tract of land. It was like a little mini farm. You would go out and mow your grass instead of plowing the fields. It gave those GIs a feeling that they owned something. The grass was kind of a callback to their farms and the flowers and all this other stuff. So, but that was all subsidized. All the infrastructure for that was subsidized. The roads were subsidized. Eisenhower came back from World War II and realized he was watching the Nazis flying around on their Autobahn with their tanks. They can move entire divisions across the entirety of Germany in hours. They could get across the entire country in I forget what the time frame was, 10 or 11 hours. In the United States, pre-World War II, there literally was no way to get across the entire United States. Think about that. Route 66, I think, that's why that was so important back then. In places, it was little more than a single lane, probably dirt in some places, and maybe possibly impassable. So all of these macro ideas are all forming to create a generation, the largest generation to ever come through the United States, of very, very privileged people. Again, they had to work for it, but what they got in return far exceeded anything they put into it. So we're in the 1960s. They're rebellious, but they're starting to settle down. They have kids. They're getting married. They become one of the most conservative generations, I think, ever. And again, I'm not talking politically. I'm talking about the true nature of being conservative, which is to preserve. They saved like no other generation ever, to the detriment of, I believe, the forward thinking of the generations before them. It's one thing to conserve, it's one thing to save, but if it's at the detriment of the rest of the generations, that becomes a problem. That is going to be a key feature of the rub that happens between millennials and the baby boom. So World War II generation starts to die off. They are leaving these subsidized housing behind for their children. Now, all of a sudden, these pieces of property, which were basically just carved into farmland throughout the country, and some of the most affluent places in the country now, like California and Florida, just by the fact that these GIs got a loan back in the 1940s, leads to California being one of the most unaffordable places on planet Earth, or at least not on planet Earth, but at least in the country. So I'm hoping you can see the lines I'm trying to draw across this. That's where a lot of this animosity is coming from. You can say, oh, I bought a house, but you bought a house that was subsidized by a governmental loan. The tax code that is used to support those houses now, you get to write off your interest. You get to write off your insurance against your home. Renters don't get to do that, as we talked about in the last video. Renters versus homeowners. You can take this property now and sell it that literally you got, a $6,000 loan for back in the 1940s, passed on to their boomer children for nothing. And that house, just by the fact that there's inflation in the system, again, we talked about what inflation is, why it's theft, is given to their children. Now they're these baby boomers. They're now in their 80s. These houses are worth, $1.2 million. They're not selling them. They're using them as collateral to take money out against, to do more purchasing and RVs. And so I hope you can kind of see where I'm going with this. So now we're going to skip over X because we're the middle children of history. Nobody gives a shit about us. And we're going to go to the millennials. And what world did they inherit? What world are they coming of age in? They're already past 18. They didn't get to go through their rebellious times. They weren't the hippies. They didn't run around. They were told to go to college. They were told to do this. They were told to do this. They took on massive amounts of debt for a world that was no longer going to be valid. That's where that anger is coming from, because now they're trying to form families. They are now like the baby boom generation when they hit their late 20s. They want to have kids. They might not want to own a piece of property like we had. The millennial generations, they live more communally. Again, my ideas of radical collectivism. Choosing who your family is. Choosing to be around more people. I grew up in an era of the subdivision. We don't use that word much anymore, but I grew up with the word subdivision. I lived in a subdivision. For millennials, they hear that word and they're like, that is a strange word. Why are you subdividing things? I didn't understand that word when I was a kid because I lived in we just basically lived in these little cookie cutter little squares. They were all subdivisions of a farm from 20 years before that. Eventually they kind of named that suburbia, because I think it sold better. Suburban living. They don't want to live that way. So here is the big macro move that I think is happening. So now the baby boom generation is just like their World War II generation parents before them are dying. There's going to be a gigantic wealth transfer of epic proportions that's already in motion. Where does that money go? What does that mean for people who are looking to invest, again, on a longer time horizon, not what meme stock you're going to be jumping into? And that is really where I'm going to start on the millennials, and why the way they look at the world is way different than all the generations before them. And they are the largest generation to come through the system in U.S. history. And they're coming of age now. Again, by coming of age, late 20s, early 30s, many of them much older than that. Again, I'm a late Xer. There's a lot of, early or younger Xers out there. We see the world very differently. Me personally, I identify more with being a younger Xer or even almost a millennial. I understand the frustrations and the problems they're having, the idea of the okay boomer. Where is the okay boomer coming from? Where is that distrust, that dislike, and soon to be hatred of the baby boom generation? It comes because of the utter, I don't know what the right word is. The baby boom generation has this entitlement idea, and yet they throw that idea out on the millennials. They say, oh, you guys are so entitled. We worked so hard. We did this, and look at what we got. And the millennials are looking at them, and they just cannot make them understand how different the world that the millennials are living in, this idea of chaos and rampant inflation. And they didn't get the $1 million piece of California property given to them, because their World War II parents willed it to them, and literally was just a piece of carved up former cropland or whatever in California, or swampland in Florida. They weren't supported by a tax code that constantly kept telling them land ownership is everything, driving the price of and allowing multiple homes to be owned by one person, driving up the cost of homes, using that as inflation for the system. There's a whole set of circumstances that people who are living in the bosom of that just will not look at. They will not understand the fact that they were provided for in their home ownership for their entire lives. That is a form of socialism. Most homeowners, and I get this, I'm a homeowner, I don't pretend it's not happening. I get a huge benefit literally just by owning that piece of property, and I'm being given preferential treatment by the tax code and by the government. That is a handout. That's socialism. That might as well just be welfare. I am getting housing welfare by owning a house. Those post-World War II millennials who inherited the homes from their parents, that is a form of home welfare. You're not going to like to hear that. I know it probably going to piss a lot of the older people off, but that's exactly what it is. It is a benefit that the millennials don't get, never got. Because what did the majority of the baby boom generation do? They used that housing as a way to leverage to other things. So then they get into investing. So they put money away, 10%, very conservative. That's what the system told them to do. Work hard. You get to work for 20, 30, 40 years. You get your pension. You get your Social Security. You put money away for 10 years, for that 20 years, 10% for 20, 30 years. And that is all coming to fruition. The largest bucket of wealth in the entire country is the baby boom generation. They hold 60 to 70% of the private equity assets in the entire country. I forget what they own. Right now, millennials own 10 to 15%. That's going to change rapidly. And what does that mean, demographically speaking, economically speaking, for the country? All of these boomers are dying. The trend is just getting into what I call the hockey stick part of the chart. That's where it's going to ramp up big time. And there's going to be a transfer of wealth like nothing else in human history. And it's happening right now, along with all of the other huge macro AI and all of it. Cryptocurrency, changing of the currency system, all of it is changing. And the people who do not see this change coming, the middle children of the world, us and the X generations, and the very, very the youngest of the baby booms, who might still have another 15, 20 years left on this earth. But the majority of that boomer generation is hitting that hockey stick of the mortality graph, to put it not so delicately. All of that money is going to start flowing into the hands of us and the X, but mostly in the millennials, either through direct inheritance or they are the grandchildren of those people. Trillions and trillions of dollars locked up in the stock market, in the real estate market. And all of that money is going to start flowing into the hands of people who have a very, very different view of risk. They grew up in a completely different generation, a completely different mindset. Whereas the baby boom generation were born of people who lived through the Great Depression and through a Great World War. Their childhood memories are of be conservative. Again, not politically speaking, I'm just talking generally speaking, conservative, save, steady, no risk. They grew up in a time of almost no inflation, 2%, 3%, pretty much without unbroken, if you were to graph it out and take out all of the ups and downs, and I'll get the boomer comes back. I lived through the 70s. Well, millennials lived through 2000. They lived through 2008. They lived through COVID, and at least 12 other major economic up and downs that have happened since really 1998. Long-term capital, which to me set off the current generation. That's what they had to live through. Almost an unbroken 40 years of economic stability where you just put your money away, take 10%, throw it in something, some blue chip blah thing, and at 30 years you get your pension, you get your money put away, and you get the property, and you get to retire to your RV. Again, this is where that anger is coming from. This is where the okay boomer comes from. What the millennials are saying to you when they say okay boomer is an entire unspoken curse at you, basically is what it is. Basically cursing at you. It's basically to say, you have the power right now. You have all of this wealth. You just will not give up control of any power levers. Just look at our freaking House of Representatives and the Senate. Just filled with a bunch of boomers who just will not give up power, and they cling to that power like their entire soul depends on it. Take all of that anger and all that angst and the fact that they're looking at how you got all of your wealth, which again was through wealth transfers from them to you. Remember what inflation is. Inflation steals from the bottom, gives to the top, whatever level you're at. If you're an asset owner, just by the very nature of owning your assets, that is a wealth transfer. Because you are being subsidized. If it was a true free market, capital would flow where it goes. 90% of these boomers would be goddamn penniless because they just took no risks. So that's where we're going with the millennials. The millennials grew up in an era of chaos, of risk, of high inflation, the subsidies dying. They kept having to pay higher and higher Social Security withholding. You didn't. You got to retire back in the 1980s and 90s and then live for 30, 40 years on your Social Security. Have you ever done the calculation on the average baby boomer and what they got in Social Security? It's not even close. The burden that is being put on the millennials, even if you just look at that little snippet, which is Social Security, they have to put in a much, much higher percentage of their take-home pay than the average boomer did, and they will get no benefit from it. Because why? Even if they get the money is going to be so inflated away. The price of everything is going to go up. It is not even apples and oranges. It's apples and zebras, what millennials have to grow up in. And yet we constantly keep denigrating this generation as being a bunch of slackers and this and blah, blah, blah. They're persevering. They have found workarounds. I just talked about meme coins and meme stocks. And one thing, if you really want to understand the millennial mindset, which was the idea of GameStop. If you don't understand what GameStop was about, this idea of the meme stock, where go look up some terms, bored apes, like they're boring, like bored apes. These Reddit posts that came up during the whole GameStop phenomena. That was them just dipping their toes into the idea of risk taking and using the system to their advantage. That is the big macro play here, is as they start to number one, they're coming of age. They're finally starting, these boomers are finally having to give up places in their companies. They're able to move up into some management, actually get paid some money. I think it's still a travesty, like what these kids are getting paid. And it's not to say all baby boomers, all millennials are doing X, Y, Z. I'll get a bunch of people come back and say, well, my millennial child's doing great. They're making blah, blah, blah. That's not, that is a one-off. Even if it's a million one-offs, the generation of the millennials is tens and tens and tens of millions. So if you can point to me at a couple million people who are doing really well, good for them. They had to work hard for it. Just like the baby boomers. The baby boomers worked hard, but they were supported in the fact that they had all of these assets given to them, which then appreciate in an inflationary system as we are in. So the millennials are taking over. They're skipping over X being the middle child of history. We're doomed to be in between the two. We take care of our millennial children and we take care of our boomer parents as they age out. It's just reality for X. It's just, we're the middle children of history. The millennials, are going to be taking this money and they're going to be radically redeploying it. I talked about this idea of radical collectivism. That there is two types of collectivism. There's forced collectivism, which is the Soviet, communist, socialist idea of collectivism. And then there is free market collectivism, which I think this country was built on, as I went in my last video two videos ago. What made this country great was when a bunch of people get together voluntarily, they create their own families. I think that's very big in the millennial thought processes, which is choose your family. You're born into your family, but the family that you spend the rest of your life with is the family you choose. Your friends, the people who think like you, not necessarily look like you. They're going to take this capital that they're going to be given, and they're going to be radically redeploying it. They dipped their toes into the whole idea of the GameStop and understood how the stock market works and how investing works. I think they're going to be some of the most savvy investors probably that has ever been seen, because they had no choice. They had to accept the risk that was thrown into their faces at a very young age as they were coming of age, out of college, out of high school, going into the work environment. They had to accept prices unanchor all the time. Inflation whips wildly back and forth. We have these huge economic events like 9/11 and the dot-com bubble in 2008. COVID probably being the biggest one, I think, that probably has solidified all of these thoughts that the millennial generation has, which is, if you slowly save and put your money away in your safe, you're going to get destroyed, as I talked about in my last video. If you're saving in US dollars, you're a fool. The system is meant to milk you, and they understand that. So this whole idea of okay boomer is slowly going to turn to fuck you boomer. And unfortunately, I'm going to get lumped into that boomer because I'm going to have gray hair and I'm going to look like them, even though I'm not. I'm more. I identify more a millennial than anything. So it's going to turn into fuck you boomer. Guess what? We're in control now. You finally have gotten so old, and you finally have to give up your positions of power. You finally have to start retiring and leaving these jobs to us, and they're not going to do it the same way. And that's where all of this animosity is coming from, because the millennials do it differently. They look at things more collectively. Again, the good collective. Let's get together with people we think like, and let's get some shit done. The whole idea of AI terrifies so many people, but it terrifies the people who aren't willing to go out and do something different. If you want to sit, this is an idea I had by one of my, I've already done this video 15 times. I'm having a hard time with it. The whole idea of AI is threatening to a person who just wants to go and put their 30 years in, work at GM, put 30 years in, get their pension, and retire. I'm sorry, I feel for the people who do that, and that had a lot of good for this, but that is not the American way. Going and being a wage slave for another company, and they use you for 30 years and wear you out and give you a pension and a watch at the end, and you want to call that good job. That is the American way. The American way is risk-taking, deploying capital, infrastructure, and I'm going to get into that because I don't want to forget that. That is a huge part of the world that World War II generation inherited. Again, the unseen help that they got. They got the unseen help of the support of the tax code and the fact that they got free, nearly free money to buy housing that inflated over the course of 40, 50 years. The other unseen benefit that those generations got was the infrastructure. The World War II generation during the Great Depression built things like Hoover Dam, water intakes. Look around the entirety of your life, and there's still remnants of that build out that happened during the 1930s. That is where the millennials are going to start putting their money. It's already happening. AI data center that I go by every time, right about in my videos right now, is going to take a massive, massive build out of the electrical grid. It has been completely and utterly ignored by the generations before them. Why? Because they were already coasting on a great infrastructure. They could make such stupid ass claims as let's go solar. Let's, and they embrace this whole, let's completely ignore rebuilding anything. Not in my backyard. You're not doing that. Go put it in the inner city where all the millennials are living and all the poor people are living. And let's run our oil infrastructure that we don't like to look at because it's not so pretty. Let's run it through Indian reservations. Let's run it through the bad neighborhoods. Keep it out of my backyard. You're not going to ruin my property. You're not going to lower my property prices. That is the millennial mindset and the X by just being we're that close to that generation. There is going to be a fight between all of that because millennials don't give a crap. They like living in the not the inner cities, but they like living in cities. They like the convenience. Toledo is a perfect example. When I was a kid, the downtown was a shithole where all the hookers hung out. You go down there now, it's filled with 20, 30, 40 somethings having a great time downtown. They're rebuilding all of these warehouses with again, I'd call it communal warehouses that are more you have a gym up in the top. We have these big lofts. You go downstairs, there's a bar, there's a restaurant, there's your favorite coffee shop. They like to live that way. So all of these houses, again, I'm looking out to my right here, if you can see it, housing that just keeps sprawling out into the middle of nowhere. All of these houses are being built by boomers and Xers because they think it's going to be a good value in the future. That's not going to be. Once the majority of these boomers start to die and they leave their property behind, they're just going to sell that shit. All these houses out in what's called exurbs, suburbs, where roads, it takes shit tons of roads, shit tons of infrastructure that really accomplish nothing. Millennials don't think that way. They think about investable. Everything is getting to be about investing, I think, for them. I tried. Again, the things you see when you cross the desert here is coyote just ran right across the road in front of me. Just looking at just one thing, which is the AI data centers. I've been trying to find an investable angle. They're already gone. Copper, first order. Prices of copper is like skyrocketed. That's not investable for me anymore. So I start looking at, where's the copper going into? Electrical substations. I start looking at what does it take to do that? Transistors, anything, chips. They're all being looked at. All of these infrastructure plays, which were so bland and safe, they've become the new bleeding edge. The millennials are building out infrastructure, and roads are not infrastructure. I'm sorry. The idea of the car is going away. Millennials, and especially the people who came after them, they want self-driving cars. They don't want whatever. Just, again, extrapolate out. They want self-driving cars. Why own a car? They can just push a button. A car will show up. You don't even need a freaking driver in it. And they can jump in it and go to where they want to go. They're building their lives where they can just walk out their back door and they have everything they need. That's an anathema to people like me. I'm purposely driving an hour and a half each way so I can go way the hell out at the edge of a national forest. I don't want to have, I don't want to be around people like that. Who knows? Maybe I'll rethink it. Having the convenience of just walking out and having all your friends in the community right out your back door. Why the hell are we spending trillions of dollars on all of this asphalt and roads and everything it takes to keep that infrastructure going? That's all being called into question by the millennials. All of it's changing. The bleeding edge of that is already, I wouldn't even call it bleeding edge. We're well into it. Roads are starting to fail way out on the edge of things. Why? Because the money to keep that infrastructure going is no longer there. It's going to be redeployed into data centers, into electrical infrastructure, new ways of creating electricity, fueling this new world that they are inheriting, finally. It's taken a long time, but they're finally going to be the ones in charge of where money is being deployed. And it's going to change everything. It's going to cause a huge rift between the generations. That's the macro move. Just to finish up on this thought, to kind of what really made me want to make this video was just last week, a boomer, late, older Xer was doing a commencement speech at a college. You have all these early 20-somethings, no longer millennials, probably alphas or whatever they are, and she's talking about the brave new world of AI, and she starts trying to go down this thought process like, how great is AI? And they all start booing her. And she has to stop, and she double takes, and she like whispers, like, it's like, are they booing me? And they were literally booing her because they understand what AI, the boomer version of AI is, which is basically they're going to take over all of the jobs. All the infrastructure is going to be going towards making sure that these AIs have electricity. The millennials, they understand what AI, it's a tool. It's not meant to take over everything. They're going to be putting clamps on that shit, I think. I think as they come to fruition, as their generation starts to take over, expect that AI is going to get a lot of controls put on it, because they don't want to have to work and compete against a robot and an AI for shit wages again. That's really what made me like want. And then she pivoted. She's like, okay, what do you guys want to harken back to a day before AI? And then they all start, before she could even finish the thought, they all start clapping and cheering, like, basically, yes, we don't want an AI future that does everything for us. But paradoxically, a very, very smart millennial, and they are by the thousands doing this, using AI as a tool, which is what it should be. AI is a tool. It's not being used that way. It's being used as a replacement. It's basically being used to say, we don't want all these millennials who have all these crazy ideas on how things work. Still, boomers and Xers are in control of how AI is being used. Expect that to be a huge battle point, where AI as a tool, good. AI as a replacement, bad. That's not going to fly. We'll see how that plays out. So anyways, I'm coming into El Paso. This one's probably running a bit long. We'll see if I like this one. Very hard video for me to do. Hopefully you're going to have a good day. I'm going to get this posted up. It's Tuesday. Usually I post on Mondays, but like I said, I've done this one 13 times now and just have not been able to nail it. So we'll see if this one worked. We'll talk to you later. Have a good day. Enjoy the weather. It's beautiful. Been beautiful here. So we'll talk to you later.